In the interest of time, please feel free to continue to write your questions down. We'll continue to come around and collect them. And as the discussion gets going, we also just invite any questions directly from the floor. Alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed us today with three giants in the Islamic community. And I say giant both figuratively and literally. There's a, mashallah, very tall crowd up here. Not really like pretty short. Sure, I thought 5'11" was tall, but no. If we can start a basketball team, I think, with this crowd. We're really blessed with these giants in the Islamic community, leaders, thought leaders, but also community leaders, who have given us so much to think about in terms of what we can do with our own masjid here in Burlington, within our own communities, with our own families. This morning there was a lively Q&A discussion, and I really want to keep that going. So I'm going to start with the first three questions we have, which I'll open them up to our speakers, and then inshallah we'll get some more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of these questions to begin with, and then we'll invite responses from our panel here. First question, Bismillah. What should the role of Muslims be in the U.S.? Should they live here long term? So a question again about maybe folks who have immigrated to the U.S., or even folks who are born here thinking about moving abroad. What should be their long-term vision? How do we deal with the with not shunning those brothers and sisters who have substance abuse problems? The issue of addiction was raised this morning, so what do we do with brothers and sisters in our community who suffer from substance abuse problems? And what was the Sahaba's name that had the drinking problem? And is there anything we can learn from our tradition about that? Can Muslim women marry men? Men of the book? Yes, can Muslim women marry men of the book? So a question about marriage, a question about substance abuse, and a question about what should Muslims do here in the U.S.? Live here long term or others? Start with those.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to answer the question about the Sahaba named Abdullah. And Abdullah, rahimahullah, had a drinking problem, and always they had to bring him to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet would scold him mildly. And someone cursed him. He said, "Don't curse Abdullah, because he loves Allah and His Messenger." And I want to say this, I think it's important. What I'm going to say, I think I really try to understand, to appreciate the Islam. When the Quran was revealed, there was a drinking problem in Mecca for sure. 13 years in Mecca, Allah never even mentioned it. Never even mentioned it. It wasn't until the 4th year of Medina that Allah finally mentioned it, and He didn't say it's prohibited. He didn't introduce the topic. Yes, they're asking you, Muhammad. They're asking you about, right? So Allah revealed, there's some prophet, and the sin is worse. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون. Do not approach salat while you're intoxicated until you know what you're saying. One Sahaba led salat and he was drunk and he messed it up. Allah still didn't prohibit it. And finally, فَاسْتَنِبُوهُ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. Why am I saying that? You may misunderstand what I'm going to say. Our religion is not a religion thou shalt not do. Of course, it's there, right? But you have to do first things first. The Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Yemen. He said of the people of the book, فَيَكُونَ عَوْلَ مَا تَدْعُوهُمْ إِلَى وَحِدِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. That the first thing you invite them to is the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're talking about priority. I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about it. We should, but give it its due preference. I close with Aisha radiallahu anha, our mother. She said, had Allah first revealed that تَشْرَبُوا خَمْرًا, don't drink khamra, the people would have said, we will never give it up. We will never give it up if Allah had first revealed that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gradually taught us. It don't mean that we can do that. No, we can't. It's haram. But we have to work with the people, inshallah.
So, what were the questions?
Yes, a couple of questions.
Should I read some more questions, or were there any of those first questions that you'd like to respond to?
Read them again.
Okay. So the first questions again were role of Muslims in the U.S. Should they live here long term? There's also a question, again thinking about temporality, about imams who are not invested in their community. They stay for a short while, break their contracts, and move to communities maybe that are bigger or can offer more pay. So this question of what we do in the short term versus long term as Muslims, as imams, that was one. Question about can a Muslim marry a man of the book? And we've got another question that just came in about is it obligatory to follow a madhab? So we'll leave it there, and then I've got a few more coming in.
Okay. I think I'll take a very simple approach. Can a Muslim woman marry Ahlul Kitab? No. So that's my response.
Good.
Yeah, that's my response. But seriously though, about the question about whether or not a Muslim should stay in the United States long term, it's a really interesting question because I would dare say that for the most part, there's no data that I have to back this up. But for the most part, the Muslims who have immigrated to this country over the years, we say from the 1920s forward, have not come here for the purpose necessarily of establishing deen.
Right.
And so their motivation for coming here may have been and has been education, is more opportunities, maybe escaping persecution in their home countries. And then there's the other population, like myself and Imam Siraj, who actually converted to the faith, and this country represents home. And for many of us who've come from oppressed communities in this country, Islam was looked at as a liberating force. It was something that could help throw off the shackles of white supremacy and structural racism. And so because the outlook for many of those coming from oppressed communities was that Islam was a liberating force, then there's more of a commitment to try to use Islam as a change agent, to try to change the society, to make an impact and influence the society. And then others, of course, have gone to try to acquire knowledge that years ago was not available, Islamic knowledge that was not necessarily available in this country, which now has changed radically. There's so many Islamic institutes. You can go to Texas and you would think in Dallas and Houston, and Dallas in particular, that you're in a Muslim country because of the access to Islamic knowledge and information. But the basic response that I would give to this is that for the most part, if anyone has made a commitment that this is home and that I'm going to be here, then those who've come from Muslim countries should have a commitment to bring Islam to this landscape, just as the people of the land have that responsibility to do it. So just to stay here with all of the things that are going on in this country is a passive kind of acceptance of the things that are plaguing the nation, unless we're trying to stand up for justice, unless we're trying to bring Islam to the people of the land.
Bismillah. I'd love to really emphasize and reiterate what our dear Imam Siraj and Imam Khalid started us with, and move to the question about Muslim spaces. Another way of looking at the question of where a person settles, where they raise their children and so on, it's a very deeply personal question. It's a very specific context. And as I'm navigating for my family or my situation, I have the right to feel that my situation may be better here or there, this, day, that. I should not feel that that's better for others or is the best, right? But there's a deeply, Imam Siraj mentioned this in his remarks, there's a very deeply personal responsibility and amana, that if a particular context is threatening or the Islam of your children, right? That doesn't mean immediately the solution is soon, but you have to look at that problem and consider, try different things. And sometimes a move, a change of circumstance, a change of, even if it's in this country, outside of it, could be the right thing in a particular context. Now we can look at this historically. I say this with shyness and humility because both Imam Khalid and Imam Siraj, I'm a student of the history of Islam in America, and they're both great influence, so they probably don't know that I listen to their material online, right? But you can classify the history of Muslims in this country in different ways, but I'm going to suggest a classification in 3 waves. Every human being in this room is connected to one of these 3 waves, in brief. The first wave, Muslims likely first came to this country as explorers, as artisans. Within 100 years of the Prophet ﷺ's death, the generation of the Sahaba was at the banks of the Atlantic, making the niyyah to bring da'wah to these lands. He said, if I knew that there were lands behind you, and he was looking at the Atlantic Ocean, then he would have went to spread the word of Allah. That's like earth-shattering. That's before the majority of the world knows that the world is round, and Columbus hundreds of years later is landing what he thinks is India and so on. Most of the first wave came in shackles. In this country's greatest sin, and one of the greatest atrocities of human history, in the transatlantic slave trade. Every Muslim in this room, especially young Muslims, need to appreciate that your ancestors, many of them dreamed of this opportunity, this conference, and did not get that opportunity once in their lifetime. And there are incredible stories in this history. I would encourage you to consider yourself the inheritor of that da'wah. Right here in North Carolina, Umar ibn Sa'id writes in Arabic, Ya Ahla America, Ya Ahla Carolina. I bet even if you don't know Arabic, you know what I just said. O people of America, O people of the Carolinas. And then his voice trails off into the voice of a slave. He never lived to see his dream. He died 1 year before the Emancipation Proclamation. But his dream was inherited by the people in this room. So that generation, to Imam Khalid's point, most of them were very intent on preserving their deen. But they faced unbelievable persecution and hatred. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala certainly opened His mercy and just because a test of surviving a day for them could be a lifetime for us, right? But there was a woman who, subhanallah, she was sharing and brought tears to the whole room's eyes. She shared that some 8 or 9 generations prior, her ancestors had to hide their masahif, had to pray in secret. You look at Abu Bakr Jallo in Maryland, would go out in Kent County, Maryland, pray in secret to pray 5 times a day. That's just to establish salah. He said, I believe that they made dua for Islam to be preserved. And I am the answer to their dua. Like this is the dream of 500 years. Now with due respect, I'm not generalizing, there's a second wave and I'll be brief. The second wave of Muslims, which is a combination of factors both with indigenous Muslims in these lands, native to these lands, and people coming from overseas, but many of the second generation, without disrespecting anybody, came for economic opportunities that Imam Khalid said, and the result is clear. In 3rd or 4th, 5th, 5th generation, Islam is not noticeable in many of these families. So we're not judging, we're learning that if the pursuit of business and opportunity and PhDs and this is so strong that we just assume you just are not Muslim, their kids lost Islam. I'm going to invite you with something about being brief. If you look hard enough, you will notice these people in your daily interactions. Imam Siraj, I was in Chicago. I'm not a fan of Chicago in December, I'll be honest. It's an incredibly cold night. And I was dressed visibly Muslim. It was a man, this horribly cold night. My wife was there. He tapped me and said, do you mind if I ask you some questions? Just looked like a typical, Caucasian gentleman from America. Didn't think he had any connection with Islam. He started asking me, what are you all doing here? What's this conference about? I asked him all these questions. Thought maybe I'm making da'wah. Imam, he told me, I know you all are not like you, like they say, because my father is a Muslim. You keep up what you do. The child of a second wave Muslim.
Yeah.
Imam Khalid, I was in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., construction site. I took a pause. I made wudu, was preparing for Dhuhr. A gentleman named Matt stopped me. He said, "Oh, no, you were washing your arms. What is that?" And he asked me question. And he said, my grandparents used to do this, and he made the motions of wudu, but that was all that was left. So this is a very serious danger, and if it's your circumstances not working, yeah, we love you in North Carolina, love you here, but yeah, we have to be ready. I'm not saying jump, think about it. How are we going to shift so that those children, and that's the thing, the completion of the story of the third wave, right, which again could be subdivided, but is largely the force of what some of the factors that our imams were sharing with earlier for Muslims within the country, as well as especially after the Kennedy administration and Muslims. This wave, the ending is not written. And the ending is dependent on our choices. To really come back to what Imam said, do you care? Do we care about the wellness of Islam in our spaces? So I just want to appreciate the questioner for bringing that forward and making a priority for all of us.
And there was another question here. How do you inspire second generation Muslims toward Islam when first generation migrants chased and instilled the American dream? So this is a big concern among some of our questioners. And I can ask a few more questions. We can. Yes. All right. I warmed you up with some softballs. Got some hard balls coming. I'm trying to categorize these as they come in, prioritizing the ones that focus on tarbiyah. We've got some kind of technical, pragmatic, fiqh questions if there's time to. But I've got a number of questions here about gender and LGBTQ issues. And I'll do my best to represent your questions accurately. There's an emphasis on LGBTQ identifying pronouns, etc. in our society. Our society also teaches inclusivity and respect, something that seems like what Islam preaches. How do we communicate to our youth to focus on inclusivity and respect without compromising our values? How do we deal with transgender or LGBT community people, especially when they come and talk to us? If I deal with the transgender man or woman, how do I interact with them? Such questions about akhlaq. What are some responses there?
Can I go back to the earlier questions? Going back to the earlier question, you said they were hardballs, so pass on that one. But in terms of the question of how do we, was it to motivate this second generation? Yeah, right. Yeah, how do we motivate the second generation for Islam? I think that beyond a shadow of doubt, the way that we operate our masajid, we are commanded by Allah to establish this place of worship called a masjid. And the rewards are clear, 27 times more every time you pray in the masjid as opposed to praying alone. So the responsibility that those who have children who are growing up, and we're trying to encourage them to go to the masajid, we have the responsibility to make those environments welcoming spaces. And with the young people I've dealt with over the years, that's one of the biggest complaints, that when I come to the masjid, there may be a basketball goal in the back, we may have a gym, we may have all of these things, but there's no attempt on the part of the older brothers and sisters to actually involve us in the affairs of the mosque. It's like, give me some young brothers, you'll go clean up the hall after we've had events and these kinds of things. And so, to amplify the point that you made, I've read some statistics saying the very same thing that you said. By the third generation, no matter how attached to Islam those initial immigrants or even Muslims who are from here, by the third generation, you can't identify that the people were Muslim. If they were Muslim, it's just Muslim in name only. So I think there's an individual responsibility, but first I'm talking about the responsibility for us to be conscious that if we want our children and grandchildren to practice Islam, we have to be committed Muslims because they, like any children, are learning from what they see and not from what we say.
Right.
And then the second point about this is that in the, I would say, the non-immigrant, and I'm trying to figure out a way to quit using the term immigrants because I think that we abuse that because there are many families who've been here for 3 and 4, Muslim families been here for many generations, and we're still referring to them as immigrants, and that's not what's going on. I mean, if you're running for president or something, maybe we can talk about immigration. But what I have seen over the years is that within the African American community in particular, that sometimes because of the effect, and I'm not trying to blame the victim, but because of the impact of structural racism in many of our communities, especially when folks are kind of trapped in inner city environments in some of our major cities, the allure of what is offered outside of these depressed communities sometimes overcome our reasoning and rationale. I have a young cousin. No, that's not my cousin. I'm thinking about my cousin. I have a great nephew, my daughter's sister's son. And this young man is in a gang. He's the only one, to my knowledge, in our little family, extended family in Winston-Salem, who's a gangbanger. And his mother and father are living in oppressed kind of conditions. So he started out just slinging drugs. He was selling drugs. And he went from that to now becoming a full-fledged gangbanger. And I look at him, and I'm not trying to apply his situation to everyone's situation, but what I'm trying to suggest is that in the African American Muslim community, where there have been generations of Muslims, the African American Muslims, to a large degree, reflect the conditions in the larger African American community. And so oftentimes those conditions overwhelm individuals and individual families. A phenomena that's growing is really crazy right now. The number of young Muslims who get incarcerated for whatever reason, who are gangbangers. They go in as Abdullah and they come out as Tupac or something. They come out with a mentality that's not consistent with what they're trying to do. So I think that we have to be, and last thing I'm going to say, we have to be more intentional in the way that we're trying to raise the next generation of Muslims. It can't just be study Quran and not address the social phenomena that they have to study and practice Islam, as young Muslims.
I want to talk a moment about the LGBT, just for a moment. The first thing I want to say, you don't ever have to apologize for anything of our deen. You don't have to apologize, you don't have to be afraid. But we want to address it the best way. What bothers me is the selective outrage of Muslims. Let me tell you what I mean. According to the World Health Organization, if the nations of the world do nothing about it, by the end of the 21st century, 1 billion people would have died as a result of smoking cigarettes. There's a Muslim store that I go to get my newspaper, owned by Muslims, workers of Muslims. So one day I go into the store and I looked at a sign that I'd never seen before. I've been going there for years. And I looked up there and said, "No alcohol sold here." I said, "Allahu Akbar." Until I looked closer. "No alcohol sold here on Sundays before 1 p.m. So I'm saying that people die as a result of alcohol. I give you statistics. So in United Kingdom, whenever they have these big supermarkets, and if a Muslim is a cashier, and if someone comes with something that's haram, they ring a bell. And some non-Muslim come and they handle it. But the hypocrisy, the stench of Muslims who sell alcohol, beer, cigarettes to the people, but they want to talk about the LGBT. Yeah, talk about it, but tell them what the Prophet said, alayhi salatu wasalam, فَيَكُونَ أَوْلَا مَتَدْعُوهُم. My secretary called me and my head of security a couple of years ago. Said, Imam, there's a brother on the sister side. So we went there and we brought him on the brother side. He dressed like a woman. And I had a nice talk with him. I didn't beat him up, anything like that. I said, we just can't have that. It's not permitted for us. We got a woman's side, we have a brother's side. And you can't go on that side. He cried and never came back again. I'm saying, give them dawah. Let me tell you something. You want to do a study? I want you to go back and study early America. Right? And I want you to look at the women. Early America, all of them had long dresses. The constant dripping of water on a stone will drill a hole in the stone. Not a flood, not a tornado, not a hurricane, a drip. And that's what they do in this society, slowly. There was a time, years ago, homosexuality wasn't that prominent in this society. I wasn't a Muslim, but it was against my fitrah. I'm not with that. Don't make me be like that. And don't you put that on my children. We have to be fine with that without being nasty and mean. We ain't nasty and mean, but it's what Allah and His messengers say. It's not permitted. That's the end of the discussion. You want to do it, that's your business, but don't you bring it here. So I'm saying to us that yes, we have to talk to the people, we have to engage with the people, but at the same time, we ain't compromising our faith. We believe in Allah and the Messenger. What Allah say is halal, it's halal. What He says haram is haram. I know Dr. Muhammad definitely want to add something to it, for sure. No question about it. Definitely.
Looking at this also from a point of view that Muslims in general, some Oriental people look at this question, right? And I want to suggest that in general, in looking at matters in Islam, have you ever gotten one of those big puzzles with a bunch of little pieces, right? So I want you to imagine when we're trying to understand part of Allah's divine wisdom in something, don't take a puzzle out of the piece, look at it, and say, this is unfair, or this doesn't. I hear that a lot from young people, right? First of all, we have to understand first. And when it's from Allah and His Messenger, our understanding is not one of rebelling, but it's probing what could be some of Allah's subhanahu wa ta'ala's saying. But first, before I judge, I gotta put it back and understand what this is part of, right? And this is a question of relationships, family, and other very fundamental things in our deen. So I'm going to express something without using actually any of these letters or terms in a very different way about our beliefs. And as Imam said, we are not responsible as Muslims actually to go around, police others and enforce those beliefs. Right. But also we should not expect people to enforce us to believe in what we don't believe in. Right. So I'm going to say, as a Muslim, and you check me on this sentence, you tell me if it does the job. As Muslims, we believe that Allah has prohibited every form of human intimacy, intimate contact. I'm going to use, high words for young people in the room, except for that which is between a single man and a single woman under the contractual institution of marriage. Let me say it again. Every form of what could be intimate in terms of physical relation between two people is prohibited in Islam, except that which is between a single man and a single woman under the contractual an agreement of marriage. So let's test this out, see if it works, right? If a person is interested in starting a family, and you know, a young man likes a young woman, but they want to be boyfriend and girlfriend, does that fit that definition? No. It's not allowed, right? Does that mean we go beat up the person? No, but we understand the boundaries
in
of
Brooklyn we do.
Okay.
I'm messing with you.
Sometimes in some parts of America, especially overseas, there's a problem with what's called zawaj, or common law marriage. It's like they live together, intend to be married, but they never do the aqd, the katb kitab. Does that work in our deen? No. Right? And so this helps us understand also part of the element of the question in terms of a broader sense, that as a Muslim, I went to high school. Quite honestly, I think a very loud minority, or perhaps a bare majority, were in boyfriends and girlfriends. But I was very confident as a young Muslim. That's not what I do. I don't need to run after these people. And this is a discussion, I hope, a space that we can build further, inshallah. I wanted to, inshallah.
Yeah. You want to add something?
Single man.
Yes, so
Islam doesn't restrict it to a single man. You can have 2, 3, 4.
I appreciate your question, and I'll be clear about why I'm using that term while using words that only the adults said. I didn't say what they're permitted to marry. I said the act of physical intimacy. So even a person that is married to more than one zawja, as you know, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted between them would only be permitted with one. And so I'm speaking specifically about the intimate act. And so even then, if there were contractual marriages with what the Quran allowed, I believe what I said would be accurate, inshallah. But thank you for clarifying.
But you need to clarify that.
Okay, we got it.
Yeah, no, you gave us that opportunity, alhamdulillah. You clarified it. Alhamdulillah.
Another quick response? We've got some other questions here.
Just before we go to the next question, just respectfully ask the permission of our imams. I actually had a commitment in Raleigh at 3 o'clock, but I couldn't avoid this, so I asked their permission to delay, but only got till 5. And so I wish I could stay till every last second, and I don't want to interrupt the flow of the
I want to
session.
tell you about Brooklyn. We would never accept that. But because of South Sheikh, we let him go.
Jazakallah khairan, everyone in this one.
So we have a number of questions here actually about interactions with non-Muslim communities. So I'll get a gist of those questions and invite responses. Let's see here. Speaking more on Islam as a social motivator, what does Islam tell us about helping to fight for non-Muslim communities? Is it enough just to be good Muslims in our communities, or do we actually have to call people to Islam? There's also a question about what should we do about children in non-Muslim schools? There's not a lot of Muslim schools in our area. What advice do you have for children attending non-Muslim schools?
In general, فَتَقُلَّ مَسْتَطَعْتُمْ, Allah says, fear Allah as much as you're able to do. I used to say that primary Islamic education ought to be free. Because there are a lot of good Muslims who want to send their children to Muslim schools but can't afford it. So that's a real issue. If you're compelled to send your children to a public school, my advice, be involved. Be involved, see what they're doing, go to the parent-teachers association meetings. You as a parent have a lot of sway, and you ought to use your power, and you don't have to apologize, but then you have to watch your children. I mentioned in this hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, I didn't give you the whole thing. Every one of you is a shepherd held accountable for your flock. But what the Prophet also said is that Allah never sent a prophet except He first sent him as a shepherd over sheep. I studied this, Imam, I studied the sheep. And I learned this about the sheep. I learned this about Allah. Allah, when He creates animals, He gives them one or two things. Number one, make blinding speed. They can fly. And the animal that is least protected is the sheep. Think about it. Can't run, right? No claws, no claws, no teeth. They can't fly. So the most vulnerable animal is the sheep. And so the prophets, all of them, every prophet was first sent as a shepherd. Allah has never sent a prophet except as a shepherd. This way we can learn and understand to appreciate that animal and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent it to us. You know what Jesus is called in the Bible? It's called the Good Shepherd. And there are all throughout the Bible you talk about the sheep and the shepherd. So that we have really a lot of work to do. So those parents that are forced to put their children in public school, to me that's the last option.
Allah